Netflix has struck a 10-year deal valued at more than $5 billion to become the new home of hit wrestling show WWE Raw, its biggest push yet into live streaming. The multi-year deal, effective in January 2025, will give the streaming giant exclusive rights to the show in the United States, as well as international distribution rights to Raw in several countries, including Canada, Latin America, and the UK. Netflix may add additional territories as existing rights deals expire. Netflix will also gain international rights to other WWE shows, including SmackDown and NXT, and other large events such as WrestleMania, the streamer and the wrestling organization's parent company, TKO, said Tuesday. The agreement gives Netflix access to about 150 hours of live content annually. So, Ben, I'm not going to step on the parallel discussion you had with Netflix co-CEO Greg Peters, but while we're cross-promoting at the top of the show here, check that out. A link to the Stratechery interviews feed is in your show notes, and I really enjoyed the talk with Greg Peters. But this particular news, which you did touch on with Peters, it hits on a few different themes we've discussed recently. So I'm wondering, what makes wrestling more attractive to Netflix than other sports rights have been? As you know, people have been wondering for years, when is Netflix going to dip its toe in the live sports rights battle? And then also, what makes Netflix attractive to the WWE?
Well, first we have to establish, I'm going to put you on this spot. Is wrestling a sport?
I've never I don't want to offend anybody because I know some really smart people who take wrestling very seriously. My best friend growing up was brilliant. He's now an accomplished doctor and was like a diehard wrestling fan. I've never been a wrestling guy. I don't personally consider it a sport, but I'm not judging the people who do. I think of this more as sort of a fun sideshow. And so maybe that hybrid model is part of why it makes more sense for Netflix. I'm not sure.
That's exactly what I was driving at. I think this is, the word sport is doing a lot of work here. What is it that makes sports compelling, right? There's an aspect of you don't know what's going to happen. And sure, that you get that with WWE. Like you don't know what's going to happen with sort of the story, but it's also a story, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are sort of scripted events, and that aspect is, I don't know. Maybe it's a distinction that doesn't really matter, but it does strike me as this is a nice sort of middle ground to move from scripted content that is recorded ahead of time and is available on Netflix to scripted content that you watch live and then is sort of in the library, sort of in the long run, to what is sort of the end state, which is there is a game going on and I don't know what's going to happen. And
Right.
no one knows what's going to happen. I guess you don't know what's going to happen if you're watching Raw, but um, that is sort of, I think, point number one that is sort of interesting to consider here. You have this entire universe of wrestling, and it's like a universe, right? Like everyone is a character, and there's
Well, and doesn't it
storylines.
run all year long also as
Exactly.
another distinction
It
from
runs
regular
weekly.
sports?
It runs weekly all year long. It's sort of an ongoing thing. There's an obvious sort of extension to like shoulder content, right? So we've talked a lot about Drive to Survive in F1. The Drive to Survive is shoulder content for F1. The actual point is the race, but then you can tell stories around that. And Netflix has had obviously a massive amount of success with Drive to Survive. They're doing it now for tennis, for golf, for basically any sport that they can imagine. They've announced that one for the NBA. And so they're definitely interested in shoulder content. And it's interesting because WWE is in some respects a combination of shoulder content and the event. It's like the shoulder content is the event. It sort of like comes
Mm-hmm.
out on sort of a regular basis. And so just sort of like structurally speaking, to the extent they're moving in this direction, this kind of just makes sense. It's not that much of an extension from what they're doing, and yet it's a massive change. They're gonna actually be broadcasting stuff live, and it's hard to divorce this happening and the amount they're paying for this from the push into ads. It just, if you're a subscription service, the ad model certainly is compelling, but it's really compelling in the sense that you can offer a lower price product and people's attention are there. And
Yep.
with something that's on at a set time every week, the what you can promise to advertisers, what you're sort of like what you can deliver is sort of much more concrete, is much more in sort of the space of TV. This brings it much closer to being a not a TV replacement as far as what you're watching, but a TV replacement in terms of sort of appointment viewing.
Hmm.
And I think that's all important.
And
Meanwhile,
appointment viewing is really important if you're trying to sell ads against the programming you're running.
well, particularly TV type of ads, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
there's lots of ads that are not appointment viewing that are just like, look, you're gonna buy a custom T-shirt like the
Right. There's
nice one you're
built-in
wearing here,
commercial breaks. Yep.
right? Which people can see if they watch the video, they can see your nice T-shirt here and you drinking a Diet Coke. But the
I can't wait till we're sponsored by Diet Coke on YouTube. Every single podcast, the Diet Coke. That's what makes it work for me.
That's right. But you know, the other thing about WWE though is it also works well as a subscription product. In fact, WWE a few years ago went pure subscription. They were you could only watch it through their app, and
Hmm.
it was pretty successful. It wasn't. I wouldn't say it was a failure. The challenge with subscriptions is you're sort of limited. You're limiting your audience. Like we've talked
Yeah.
about that in the kind of trajectory. Like
Customer
how do you
acquisition.
customer acquisition? They have to go get an app. You're not just sort of there available. And so, you know, a few years ago, Comcast came to them and say, hey, you know, come back to cable, you know, and be on Peacock, you know, sort of a day later, but there was still sort of cable first. And so they went back to Peacock and they increased how much, you know, increased how much they were making. But this bit about it's kind of proven, right? There's a hardcore base of fans that will follow this around and will subscribe to it. It
Hmm.
is an event, as you mentioned. It's on every week, all year long. So if someone who is a wrestling fan, they're never canceling, right? Because
Right.
it's sort of always on. It's an ongoing story. And by the way, they don't have the big events, WrestleMania. They don't have those pay-per-view events in the US. They do have them internationally. I would imagine they'll want them in the US, but suddenly you have a great customer acquisition channel too, where you could go pay for a pay-per-view or you could just subscribe to Netflix, right? And you can
Hmm.
sort of get this event and then you're locked in and you're sort of there year round. So there's a lot of pieces of this that sort of make sense. But I think when you zoom out, I wrote for years and years and years when Netflix would never get into sports rights. And the shit adding ads changes things. It just does. Like it becomes much more compelling from a business sort of perspective. It's much more accessible, and Netflix is the one entity that can go to someone like the WWE or perhaps in the future other sort of sports leagues and say, look, we understand that cable gives you wide distribution and access. We give you wider distribution and
Right.
access. People like we're bigger than cable, which they are.
Right. Well, and it's sort of a bridge between the WWE streaming model and, working exclusively with cable because Netflix can pay the WWE well, but also offer like a massive built-in audience and a chance to build that audience. That was one of the things that I found interesting about this deal is the F1 deal and the reason that investment has succeeded to the extent that it has is because the F1 market in America was completely untapped. And it sounds like, according to Peters, one of the reasons WWE was really enticing is because the international market is untapped. So it's sort of inverted, but there's a lot of room to grow wrestling around the world. And this is a global brand. So it's going to have value in that context. In the American sports context, it's hard not to juxtapose this with the conversation we had about NBC and Peacock a couple weeks ago. NBC paying Peacock $110 million to host one NFL playoff game. And then Peacock's not going to have any NFL products or any meaningful NFL products to offer its customers that signed
For
on
another
in
year.
early January.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
And so this is, again, inverting that model. It's a smarter investment because you're getting 52 weeks of inventory here. Like it may be event, but it's also inventory-ish in that it's going to be there over and over again. And you and Peters, you were building on the idea that came up in, I think, that same Peacock podcast where the value in the digital world is not necessarily about any single event that you could deliver or any piece of content you can deliver, but the real value is creating the expectation that you're going to have content worth consuming on a recurring basis. And that's what Netflix has done with the entire market for all sorts of different niches that they
Right. We'll always
serve.
have stuff for you to watch.
And this is furthering that goal. And it just sort of, I think it inverts a lot of the logic that people bring to the streaming conversations, where for the last 10 years, people have been trying to spend on splashy hits for customer acquisition. And I think the further we go here and we see all these people churning on all these different streaming services, there's also real value on content that's going to prevent churn and continue to deliver value over and over again, as opposed to spending $1 billion on the Lord of the Rings show or whatever Prime Video did a year or two back with Bezos. Like,
Yeah,
I think this is a different model.
I can't overemphasize this. This subscription business is about churn management. And
Yeah.
people in like business SaaS know this, right? Like it's so much more expensive to acquire a new customer than to sort of keep an old one. And it does feel like no one in Hollywood understood the question of churn, and maybe they still don't. There was this remarkable chart Peter Kafka shared, and we'll put a link to it in the show notes. But like Netflix's monthly churn is less than 2%. Now, that's still kind of high. Like your average customer is going to be gone in a year and a half if you sort of sketch that out. But
Yep.
then you go to something like everyone else who's between like 5 and 10%. You're getting a customer and they're gone in months. And like
It's shocking that this is how that economy works, because literally it means, in order to just break even on audience, if you're churning between 5 and 10% per month, and really, we'll click the link in the show notes so you can look at this chart, because basically everybody
it's
is
jarring to
between
see how
5 and
much different Netflix
10%.
is than everybody else.
Netflix is just hovering along at 2% there at the bottom of this chart, and everybody else, you have to continue growing by 10% or 5% every month just in order to sort of stay at that break even point. And it just puts a ton of pressure on all of these streaming networks to continue to acquire customers. And Netflix, their genius has been coming up with ways to avoid that churn. So
Yeah,
yeah, that's the
people
name of the
people
game.
subscribe to Netflix and something else, right? And this is, it's all about, they talk all the time, making our customers happy. Like it sounds cliche, but that's exactly right. That's exactly how I've operated trajectory for this last decade. Like literally nothing else in my life matters. Customer acquisition doesn't matter. YouTube doesn't matter. Nothing matters other than, and I try to structure my life in different ways. All that matters is that I have dedicated time every day to write a good daily update, and that the people who get that feel happy about it. Because if I keep my customers, everything else falls into place. Like that is the core of any sort of subscription business. And Netflix gets that, and WWE fits into that so cleanly.